The Whispering Woods. Emily was a nature enthusiast. Her weekends were often spent hiking through dense forests, exploring trails few dared to take. One particular Saturday, she decided to venture into the Whispering Woods, a place infamous among locals for its eerie atmosphere. The forest was dense, with ancient trees towering above, their twisted branches casting long, dark shadows. As she delved deeper, the sounds of nature grew faint, replaced by an unsettling silence. The path, once clear, became tangled with roots and vines, almost as if the forest itself was trying to trap her. Emily felt a strange presence, as though she was being watched. She brushed off the feeling and continued, but the further she went, the stronger it became. Suddenly, she heard it, faint whispers carried by the wind. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't quite understand. Panic set in as she quickened her pace, but no matter how fast she walked, the whispers followed. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow through the trees, and Emily realized she had lost her way. The path was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of trees and darkness. The whispers became voices, surrounding her, mocking her fear. "You're not alone," they taunted. "We see you." Emily's heart raced as she spun around, searching for the source. She saw nothing but trees and shadows, but the voices were relentless. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony in her head. She covered her ears, trying to block them out, but it was futile. The voices were inside her mind, clawing at her sanity. In a desperate attempt to escape, she ran, not caring where she went, just wanting to be free of the voices. But the forest was alive, its roots tripping her, its branches clawing at her skin. She stumbled and fell, hitting her head on a rock. As she lay there, dazed, she saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, their faces twisted in anger and sorrow. They were the lost souls of the Whispering Woods, those who had wandered too deep and never returned. They surrounded her, their voices now a haunting chorus. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the faces of the dead, their eyes filled with a longing she couldn't comprehend. The silent phone. Jack had recently moved into a small apartment in the city. It wasn't much, but it was his own space. The building was old, with creaky floors and thin walls, but he liked the charm of it. One night, as he was settling in to watch TV, his phone rang. He picked it up, but there was no one on the other end. Just silence. He shrugged it off, thinking it was a wrong number. But the calls continued, each time the same silence on the other end. He tried to ignore it, but the frequency of the calls increased, always at the same time, 3:33 a.m. One night, frustrated, Jack yelled into the phone, demanding the caller to speak. For a moment, there was nothing, and then he heard it. A faint, raspy breath. His blood ran cold as the breathing grew louder, more labored, like someone struggling to speak. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, but the only response was the sound of static, followed by a voice, barely a whisper. "I'm coming for you." Jack slammed the phone down, his heart pounding. He checked the call logs, but there was no record of the calls. He tried to convince himself it was just a prank, but the fear gnawed at him. That night, he couldn't sleep, every noise in the apartment amplifying his anxiety. The next night, the phone rang again at 3:33 a.m. Jack hesitated, then answered. This time, the voice was clearer. "I'm here." Jack's heart stopped as he heard footsteps, not through the phone, but outside his door. He grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the door cautiously. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He flung the door open, ready to defend himself, but the hallway was empty. Shaking, he closed the door and locked it, but the sense of being watched lingered. Days passed, and the calls stopped, but the feeling of unease never left. Jack started noticing small things. His belongings moved, doors left open, the faint smell of decay in his apartment. He tried to brush it off, but the paranoia consumed him. One night, as he was trying to sleep, he felt a presence in the room. He opened his eyes and saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was tall, with long, skeletal fingers and hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Jack screamed and reached for his phone to call for help, but it was too late. The figure moved swiftly, its icy hand covering his mouth. As the darkness closed in, Jack realized the voice on the phone wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The forgotten doll. Lily loved to collect dolls. Her room was filled with them, each one carefully displayed on shelves. One day, while visiting a flea market with her mother, she spotted a doll unlike any she had ever seen. It was old, with a cracked porcelain face and dull, glassy eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Lily felt an inexplicable connection to the doll and begged her mother to buy it. Reluctantly, her mother agreed, though she found the doll unsettling. That night, Lily placed the doll on her shelf with the others, but it seemed out of place among her colorful, pristine collection. As the days passed, strange things started happening. Lily would find the doll in different positions, its head turned as if watching her. Her other dolls, once her pride and joy, began to lose their luster, their vibrant colors fading, their eyes dulling. One evening, Lily's mother noticed the change in her daughter. She seemed withdrawn, almost fearful. When asked about it, Lily hesitated, then confided that the doll was speaking to her. At first, her mother dismissed it as childish imagination, but Lily was insistent. "She says terrible things, Mommy. She says she's going to hurt us." Alarmed, her mother decided to get rid of the doll. She took it out to the trash that night, but when she returned, she found Lily crying, clutching the doll. "I couldn't let her go," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. That night, Lily's mother had a terrible nightmare. She dreamed of a dark figure standing over her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. When she woke up, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She rushed to Lily's room, only to find her daughter sitting on the floor, surrounded by her dolls, all of them staring blankly at the forgotten doll in her hands. Lily's mother decided to take drastic measures. She burned the doll, watching as its porcelain face cracked and blackened in the flames. But as the doll burned, she heard it, a faint, high-pitched scream, like the wail of a tormented child. The next morning, Lily seemed better, the color returning to her cheeks. The nightmare appeared to be over, and they tried to move on. But every night, Lily's mother would wake up to the sound of a faint scratching at her bedroom door, like tiny porcelain fingers trying to find their way back in. The vanishing lights. Daniel was a night security guard at an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The place was massive, with long, dark hallways and rooms filled with rusted machinery. It had been shut down for years, but rumors circulated about strange occurrences, unexplained lights, and eerie sounds. Daniel didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't deny the factory had a creepy vibe. The power would often flicker, and there were cold spots that made his skin crawl. But he needed the job, so he brushed off the unease and focused on his rounds. One night, during his usual patrol, he noticed something odd. One of the old lights in the factory floor flickered on, casting a dim, yellow glow. Daniel knew the power was supposed to be off in that area, so he went to investigate. As he approached, the light grew brighter, almost blindingly so. He shielded his eyes, trying to see what was causing it. When he got closer, the light suddenly went out, plunging the factory into darkness. Daniel cursed and fumbled for his flashlight, but when he turned it on, the beam barely cut through the thick darkness. He felt a chill run down his spine as he heard a faint buzzing sound, like electricity crackling in the air. The light flickered back on, but it wasn't just one light now. Every light in the factory was on, flickering erratically, casting long, eerie shadows. Daniel felt something was very wrong. He turned to leave, but the lights went out again, leaving him in pitch blackness. He heard footsteps echoing through the halls, but they weren't his. They were fast, erratic, and coming closer. Panicked, Daniel ran, but no matter where he went, the footsteps followed, always just behind him. He turned corners, ducked into rooms, but the footsteps never stopped. They grew louder, more insistent, as if something was chasing him. In his terror, Daniel tripped over a loose wire and fell hard, the flashlight skidding out of his hand. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw them, shadows moving in the darkness, their forms shifting and twisting as they advanced. They weren't human. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as the shadows closed in, their whispers echoing in his ears, indistinguishable but filled with malice. Desperate, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and flicked it on, shining it at the shadows. For a moment, they hesitated, recoiling from the light. But it wasn't enough. The shadows seemed to absorb the light, growing darker, more defined. He stumbled back, the realization hitting him that he was trapped. The shadows surrounded him, their cold presence suffocating. He could feel the temperature drop, his breath visible in the freezing air. Daniel knew there was no escape. The shadows were too close now, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, filling his mind with fear and despair. In a final act of desperation, Daniel bolted towards the nearest exit, the shadows lunging after him. He slammed through the door and into the night air, but the darkness seemed to follow, clinging to him like a living thing. He ran, not daring to look back, the factory looming behind him like a dark, malevolent entity. When he finally reached the safety of his car, he jumped in and drove off, not stopping until he was miles away. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind reeling from the terror he had just escaped. But even as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Daniel quit his job the next day, refusing to ever set foot in that factory again. But the experience haunted him. Every night, when he closed his eyes, he would see the shadows moving in the darkness, hear the whispers in his ears. No matter where he went, he couldn't escape the feeling that the shadows were still with him, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one night, as he lay in bed, he noticed something strange. The lights in his apartment began to flicker, just like they had in the factory. His heart sank as he heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching, growing louder with each passing second. He knew what was coming, but this time, there would be no escape. The shadows had found him, and they were here to stay.